This video is sponsored by Squarespace. The making of Terminator Salvation is so interesting that it might be better than the final film itself, because whilst I personally do like this movie, the lengths they went to behind the scenes to keep things both realistic and practical, whilst also deliberately honouring and evolving the special effects legacy of this franchise, is just absurd. Because this film was able to seamlessly blend the exact same real-life effects of its predecessors with modern-day groundbreaking CGI techniques to craft a, most of the time, completely photorealistic result. And so that's why we're going to break down this film's quite underrated technical achievements to explore why it sometimes looks so good, but also the specific reasons as to why other times it looks kinda bad. In addition to exploring how the visual effects process affected the narrative of this film, and therefore resulted in stuff like the Terminators just throwing people rather than, just unaliving them. And all in all, basically just uncovering this film's efforts, both practically and digitally, to reveal a film that was probably so stressful to make that I can almost understand why Christian Bale flipped out making it.
Oh, good for you! And how was it?
So, ruin the take and then get your lights smashed up as we dive into the visual effects of Terminator Salvation. So why did Terminator Salvation have such a focus on doing things practically? Well, when this film was first going into production, apparently the franchise owners knew that no one really wanted a Terminator 4, because now I'm a bit too young to know the full cultural impact of Terminator and its sequels, but it seems like the previous film, Terminator 3, had left a pretty bad taste in a lot of people's mouths, and basically given the impression that by being so similar to Terminator 2, this world had pretty much just run out of stories to tell, which I just find incredible to hear that they knew all the way back then that this franchise had basically run out of steam, and yet even today they keep churning out worse and worse versions of Terminator films with the exact same plot. But yeah, at the time, it also didn't help the public perception that the director they brought in, McG, was best known for doing Charlie's Angels, a film that probably doesn't prepare you very well for doing a Terminator film. But he was brought in because he and the rest of the team had this idea that the Human Terminator War was the one story that this franchise had left to tell. And so with this, and to win fans back, McG wanted to honour as much of the legacy of the previous films as possible, and therefore aimed to craft his film with similarly groundbreaking and completely photorealistic visual effects. Which nicely brings me on to how they masterfully crafted the main Terminator of this film, and that was the T-600 Terminator. Because to manifest these guys, the filmmakers deliberately used a mix of absolutely everything they had to hand. From real controllable puppets, to motion captured actors that would later be replaced with CGI, to even like this Terminator suit thing here, where a guy could essentially play the Terminator on set and then later only need to have his specific parts be digitally replaced. All of which initially helps to give you this fantastic CGI result, because now by capturing so much real detail, you can either just keep it in the final film because it already looks so good, or use it as reference to perfectly match your CGI against, and therefore make sure that all of your lighting and textures and reflections are absolutely accurate for that shot. But at the same time, despite having all of this real data there on set, as usual, it's never actually just as simple as matching the movement of your CGI Terminator up to the movement of a stuntman and then just calling it a day. Because not only did some of the human actors' performances need to feel mechanical and menacing in a way that a human actor just can't, which actually resulted in 95% of their motion captured performance being replaced with hand animation, but also these T-600s needed to feel true to the lore and the world of Terminator. Because the Terminator we saw in the original films, the T-800 Terminator, was supposed to be this sleek, efficient killing machine that could wear the skin of a human in order to blend in. But with this film being set only 9 years in the future at the time, and only around 18 years after Judgment Day in this overly complicated timeline, the filmmakers wanted to show the evolution of the Terminators up to that point. But with literally the only reference to Skynet's skeletal technology being the T-800, all they could do was backwards evolve this design until it matched that description we heard in Terminator 1, with them eventually deciding that this earlier model would keep all of the Arnold robot's key features, but that it would be like going from from an iPhone to a PC, where the T600 would now feel just a lot bigger and bulkier and clunkier. And so by capturing these real puppet and human performances there on set, and then later on putting in a lot of effort to turn that into a big hulking Terminator, I think they achieved a really special result, because there's just no other way to capture the fear in an actor's eyes as when they're really staring down a big massive killing machine, or when they're really getting shot at for real. And so beyond just being the typical lighting and reflection reference, I think these practical effects here also bring a truly grounded nature to the performance of each scene, even just down to simple things like how with the props there, the filmmakers can now actually frame the cameras around these real robots to create a scene that genuinely feels realistic, because it basically is. But now, before we go giving all of the credit to the practical effects for all of the realism in this film, there has been one key piece of information that I've been deliberately withholding, and that is that in this scene here, many of the parts of the body may be practical, but the head is always completely CGI, because the filmmakers did make a real prop head for the Terminator suit, which matched the T600's description of looking obviously non-human, but after shooting the scene, they just weren't really that happy with the final result of it. And so they had their visual effects teams come in and replace it with a CGI variant in every single shot. And so the fact that we have a mix of the two effects here, and the fact that that isn't immediately obvious to us, goes to show just how right they got this sequence, and probably just how right they got every other sequence with a skeletal Terminator as well, because all of these were almost certainly a similar blend of the two techniques. But now, speaking of things that they got absolutely right, if we're exploring how this film used a mix of practical effects, CGI, stunts and props, and just everything they could find to achieve an end result which just really blends together perfectly, then there is nothing more underrated than these few sequences here. Because I probably can't show the whole thing due to copyright, but these shots here are some of those big, long shots that have no visible cuts, but which are actually many multiple individual shots that have been invisibly cut together to make it seem like one big coherent sequence. And this is something that we see more and more often these days, and it's almost always quite impressive. But what blew me away with this sequence was that whilst the individual elements here may not be 100% perfectly integrated, which is something that we'll get to a bit later in the video, the sheer complexity behind how they pulled all of this together was just ridiculous. Because unlike a lot of these other examples which were generally set in one location, here the individual smaller shots were often filmed in completely different locations, which then had to be seamlessly blended into one another to create this flowing result. For example, the scenes where Christian Bale is on the ground here were filmed on location, but then all of the scenes that are outside of the airborne helicopter were actually filmed on this lot here, and then the shots inside of the helicopter were actually filmed in like this custom helicopter spinning rig thing here, and then finally, as the helicopter crashes and Christian Bale gets out, we're back on that first location again. And so when you also factor in things like many of these radar dishes actually being little miniature models, and just all of the other hundreds of little elements which they had to subtly integrate into this, I do think Terminator Salvation takes the cake as the most complex and insane version of these long takes that I've ever seen. And so again, much like with the heavily practical Terminators, these long shots are an example of the absurd, invisible and completely underrated efforts that this film went to do something different. Also, is that Terry Crews playing a dead guy? What a cameo. But anyway, you know what is also an absurdly underrated sequence that absolutely deserves more credit? Every single thing that takes place inside of the Terminator factory. But before we get to that, I wanted to introduce you to the sponsor of today's video, Squarespace, because I have been loving having my own website, as not only was I able to get all of this up and running in basically a day, but I am also just so excited about the freedom it presents me to expand my business in any way I want to. As previously I built a free online course using another service, and it was just a nightmare to get it working. I got it there in the end, but it was just so much effort that I left the presentation of the site just very basic and bare bones. But with Squarespace, I now have this fantastic website which I can use as this hub for every single thing I do, meaning that now I have this clean portfolio which I can present to potential collaborators of this channel, and which has been massively helpful for bringing in potential talent behind the scenes. And then beyond this, I was also able to use the site to generate further opportunities for myself. For example, I opened up this page here where people can get in touch with me to provide them with voiceovers and stuff, because you know, I sound pretty brilliant. And without Squarespace, just none of that would be possible, because just creating simple things like this email form here would have been an absolute nightmare, and I honestly would have just given up after like 10 minutes. So whether you're just starting out or managing a growing brand, Squarespace makes it easy to build the exact website you want and then grow your business in any direction you see fit. So head to squarespace.com for a free trial, and when you're ready to launch, go to squarespace.com/CGY to save 10% on your first purchase of a website or domain. And with that, now back to the video and back to just how underrated the Terminator factory is. Because firstly, this set is just amazing, with its designers building the vast majority of it for real, and therefore filling it full of smoke, sparks, mechanical components, and even going as far as getting these real robot arms which could construct the Terminators and make it feel like this location was truly alive and truly at the heart of Skynet. But as amazing as this is, all of the smoke and sparks you see here actually made it an absolute nightmare to add any CGI to this scene, because now not only do you have to integrate your CGI into this smoke, but also all of these sparks have to realistically reflect off of the surfaces of your metallic CGI characters, which meant that the visual effects teams really had to get their digital metals working absolutely perfectly, which back in 2009 was no easy thing to do, because basically the entire time that I've been doing CGI, digital metals have just worked. You know, you just set up its basic properties and then you place a light down and just everything behaves how it would in real life. But Terminator Salvation was, I believe, the very first film where they actually achieved these genuinely physically accurate metals that operated with this real life way of reflecting light. And so before this, as I've discussed in other videos, in earlier films like Iron Man and Transformers, the visual effects teams were basically just faking their metals by often using brute force approaches to manifest them and basically just tricking us as the audience into accepting them as real. But by having this revolutionary technical breakthrough on Terminator Salvation, not only were they able to light their robots in a much more realistic and effective way, but they were also able to get the Terminators reflecting light so accurately that the visual effects teams actually had to turn down how many sparks were bouncing off of them, because there were just so many on the set that they were actually ruining how the digital robot looked. But in the end, when combined with similar practical effects to the T600, what they ended up making here is, in my opinion, absolutely the best looking sequence in this entire film. And so given all of the fantastic digital achievements here, I think it's just such a shame that this whole sequence is overshadowed by the kind of good, kind of bad looking CGI Arnold. And that if they went for the original plan for this sequence, which I have an entire video plan for in the future, I think this scene would be remembered so much more fondly. But now, speaking of that scene with the T800, this brings me to perhaps my favourite piece of behind the scenes information that I learned whilst researching this film, which was the exact reason as to why the Terminators just throw people around. Because this is a thing that in basically all of the later Terminator films, but especially this one, gets a lot of criticism. That rather than just literally winning the fight by squeezing their hands around a squishy human, the Terminator's favourite attack is to just throw them around like Gordon Ramsay with a salmon. But in Terminator Salvation, from a visual effects perspective, there was actually a very interesting reason for this. And that was that, because they were using stuntmen in motion capture suits to get the baseline of the Terminator's performance on the computer, it meant that they could not only have the two actors grapple with one another and therefore create a bit more of an interesting and dynamic fight, but they also felt that by having the CGI character interact with the real actors as much as possible, it would help make the entire fight seem so much more grounded and weighty and real, because now you're getting this genuine dynamic interaction between the two, without which is often why CGI feels so disconnected from the world around it. And so essentially clearly they were doing this on purpose in pursuit of realism to get the most out of both their practical effects and their motion capture technology. And so whilst, yeah, you do have to turn your brain off quite a bit to enjoy these fights, again, I do think they are some of the high points of this film visually. So whatever mindset they did have behind the actors and the CGI interacting clearly did work well overall. But now, speaking of what worked and what didn't when it comes to this film's CGI, this finally brings us to the other Terminators in this film and how the familiar efforts that the filmmakers went to keep them both practical and grounded can also be used to reveal this film's weak points visually. Because, much like the skeletal robots, each of these Terminators were also just absolutely crammed full of practical effects. For example, this chase sequence here was actually shot with real bikes that were stand-ins for the CGI Moto Terminators, which, much like before, allowed the filmmakers to stage and then film a physically accurate and down-to-earth chase sequence that, when combined with similarly brilliant visual effects, actually feels real and dangerous and engaging. And then the waterborne Hydra Terminators were also manifested in a similar way and achieved a similarly engaging result, with these highly durable waterproof puppets being controlled by guys underwater in wetsuits, which again, with a lot of CGI, resulted in what is absolutely the best and most terrifying scene in this entire film. And so when considering the practical baseline of a lot of this movie, I find it really interesting that whilst the massive harvester and the flying hunter killers here still look pretty good, of all of the different Terminators, not only are they the least well integrated into the shot, but they're also the ones with the least practical effects involved. Because sure, whilst the world that the harvester interacts with was very practical, like this massive explosion here that they actually did for real, or this complicated rig they built so that they could actually rip people out through the ceiling, for the actual robots themselves, they were just too big to have any part of them be done practically, leading them to be a completely CGI manifestation, and also resulting in us being able to tell that. Which I think kind of brings me on to what went wrong with a lot of this film's visual effects. Because as much as I like to give CGI credit where credit is due, I would actually say that it's the practical effects that are carrying this film quite hard. Because don't get me wrong, some of the CGI here is just incredible, both visually and technically. Like this groundbreaking effect here with the molten lava and how it forms across the Terminator like a Grim Reaper's cloak, but other parts look just not so good. And I reckon this is because this film's visual effects were actually put together in only around 11 months, whilst similar films like Iron Man had at least 13 months to make their visual effects, and Transformers probably had something closer to 24 months to do its effects. So this is just a ridiculously short time frame, and I think this is why you have such a major variation in quality throughout this film, because some of these scenes probably just didn't have enough time to be perfected. And so by doing so much of this practically, like most of the explosions or even most of the general destruction effects in this film, you not only take a lot of pressure off of the visual effects crew, but you can also help to enhance their probably rushed work. However, in addition to this, these already tight timeframes were probably massively exacerbated by one other major factor, and that was the color grade in this film. Because unlike other visual effects heavy films like Pirates of the Caribbean or Transformers, this film has a really washed out colour palette, where its darkest areas just fade into blackness, and its brightest areas aren't actually all that bright at all. You know, just like the plot of Terminator Genesis. And the filmmakers did this to help with this film's portrayal of the future being this barren, horrible nuclear wasteland, and I think this was a really good choice because it gives this film such a distinctive and miserable look, but this also put a major strain on this film's visual effects, because now to match this dramatic look, the visual effects teams had to majorly depend on things like those new physically accurate metal materials they made, as these were the only things that were flexible enough to cope with this lack of colour while still remaining realistic. But these new metals were also, when compared to the older methods, very, very slow to calculate, meaning it took longer to iterate over each shot, which when you're already operating on very tight timeframes, is literally the last problem that you want to be dealing with. But at the same time, the film's visual effects supervisor, Ben Snow, did have something very interesting to say about their breakthroughs with CGI metal and how all of this interplays with this unique color palette, saying that each year, as tools become more sophisticated and computing power increases, CG artists have the opportunity to experiment with the art of visual effects in new ways. The look of this film and the kinds of visual effects it incorporates provides a dramatic example of just how far the industry has come. And beyond this, he then went on to say how these physically correct metals gave artists more time to spend on the aesthetic side of lighting, rather than just trying to get an image that looks real, and how we're now moving past the struggle against it looking CGI, and we're moving to the point where we can have some fun with it. I feel we just need to get the speed of our metals up a little bit so that we can exploit that more in the future, which I think might just be a great summary for Terminator Salvation in general, that whilst it may not be the best film in the world, it put a lot of work into experimenting and trying something new, both narratively and technologically, and therefore brought us something different whilst also staying true to the roots of the franchise. And all in all, I personally do really like this movie, and I'm very happy with its overall visual quality, especially considering all of the challenges they had to face. But what do you guys think? Let me know in the comments below, and I'll be doing a video on all of the attempts to make a CGI Arnold soon, so please subscribe for that as well. And once again, I'd like to thank all of my Patreon subs who help to keep these videos as high quality as possible. And if you want to support the channel and have a cool hat, then go to cgy.com.